All right, so this afternoon it's my pleasure to introduce Colm Toibin. His name is synonymous with contemporary Irish literature. He has a vast catalogue under his belt, being the author of 11 novels, including The Master, Brooklyn, The Testament of Mary, Nora Webster, House of Names, and The Magician. His work has been shortlisted for the Booker Prize 3 times, has won the Costa Novel Award and the International Dublin Literary Award. He has also published 2 collections of stories and many works of non-fiction. His new book, Long Island, is the sequel to the book he wrote 15 years ago, the aforementioned Brooklyn. It returns to the protagonist, Eilis, now in her 40s, and to Ireland in the 1970s, and the possibilities of rekindling the romance she left behind all those years ago. Tóibín will be in conversation with Hilary Kelly. Kelly is a critic and an essayist living here in Washington, D.C. Her work appears in numerous publications, including The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The New York Times, New York Magazine, and Vogue. So please join me in welcoming Colm Toibin and Hilary Kelly.
Thanks very much for coming. I'm going to read the opening of the book, so I'm not giving the plot away. And I decided to write a book with a plot, which I've never really done before, and I then had to work out what a plot was. And I'm informed by one of my colleagues at Columbia, Edward Mendelsohn, that a plot is an action that has consequences, or an action that gives rise to consequences, or an action that allows consequences to occur. So it's not just one thing. You can't just have an explosion. That's not enough. You need the consequences. And he says the consequences cannot be obvious, and it's not as though you can plan it. Things must be unpredictable. I asked him then, could you give me an example of a plot? And he said that The Mayor of Casterbridge was a good plot, in that it's Thomas Hardy's novel, and it opens at a fair where there are many things for sale and many people auctioning various things. And it opens with a man coming into a town in the south of England, and he suddenly stands up on the podium, and he's joining in the auction, and he just says, "I wish to put my wife up for sale." And that's the action. You can start with that, but it's never enough. It's the first thing you want to know. It's like if you ever see a bus and someone running to get it, you always want to see if he or she got the bus. In the same way as you want to know now that there's always a man, and he's always over there in the novel, and he's always coming towards the novel, and he puts his hand up and says, "I'll buy her." And that's the first consequence. And you then know that that evening, that man who no one knows, that stranger, that dark stranger, that silent man, he walks out of the town with that woman. Now what you have then is, no matter what you do for the rest of the book, that is an undercurrent. Even if you go 200 pages without that scene, or without any mention of it, you know somehow or other that it's going to have consequences, that it's going to recur, that it's going to matter. This is the opening of this novel, Long Island. It's Long Island, it's 1976, and it's Eilis Lacey who appears in the novel Brooklyn. So it's 25 years after the novel Brooklyn. She's in her mid-40s now. And she is living in Long Island with her husband, Tony, her 2 children, Larry and Rosella, and in the next house is her mother-in-law, and in the other 2 houses, there's a cul-de-sac of 4 houses, are her 2 brothers-in-law with their families. I think that's all we need to know, but this is just the opening of the book, so, you really don't know anything, but you're going to know something now. That Irishman has been here again, her mother-in-law said, sitting down at the kitchen table. He's come to every house, but it's you he's looking for. I told him you would be home soon. What does he want? Eilis asked. I did everything to make him tell me, but he wouldn't. He asked for you by name. He knows my name. Her mother-in-law's smile had an insinuating edge. Eilis appreciated her mother-in-law's intelligence and also her sly sense of humour. Another man is the last thing I need, Eilis said. Who are you talking to? Her mother-in-law replied. They both laughed as Francesca, the mother-in-law, stood up to go. From the window, Eilis watched her walk carefully across the damp grass to her own house. Soon, Larry, her son, would be in from school, and then Rosella from afternoon study, and then she would hear Tony parking his car outside. Tony's her husband. This would be a perfect time for a cigarette. Remember, this is 1976, when you could still write that sentence. This would be a perfect time for a cigarette. But having found Larry smoking, she had made a bargain with him that she would give up completely if he promised not to smoke again. She still had a packet upstairs. When the doorbell rang, Eilis stood up lazily, presuming that it was one of Larry's cousins calling for him to come out. However, from the hallway, she made out the silhouette of a grown man through the frosted glass of the door. Until he called out her name, it did not occur to her that this was the man her mother-in-law had mentioned. She opened the door. "You are Eilis." The accent was Irish, with a trace, she thought, of Donegal, like a teacher she'd had in school. Also, the way the man stood there, as though waiting to be challenged, reminded her of home. "I am," she said. "I've been looking for you." His tone was almost aggressive. She wondered if Tony's business could owe him money. "So I hear. You are the wife of the plumber." Since the question sounded rude, she saw no reason to reply. "Is he as good as his job, your husband? I'd say he's in great demand." The man stopped for a second, looking behind him to check no one was listening. "He fixed everything in our house," he went on, pointing a finger at her. "He even did a bit more than was in the estimate. Indeed, he came back regularly when he knew that the woman of the house would be there and I would not. And his plumbing is so good that she's to have a baby in August." He stood back and smiled broadly at her expression of disbelief. "That's right. That's why I'm here. And I can tell you for a fact that I am not the father. It had nothing to do with me, but I am married to the woman who's having this baby. And if anyone thinks I am keeping an Italian plumber's brat in my house and have my own children believe that it came into the world as decently as they did, they can have another think." He pointed a finger at her again. "So as soon as this little bastard is born, I am transporting it here. And if you are not at home, then I will hand it to that other woman. And if there's no one at all in any of the houses you people own, I'll leave it right here on your doorstep." He walked towards her and lowered his voice. "And you can tell your husband, from me, that if I ever see his face anywhere, I'll come after him with an iron bar that I keep handy. Now, have I made myself clear?" Eilis wanted to ask him what part of Ireland he was from, as a way of ignoring what he had said, but he'd already turned away. She tried to think of something else to say that might engage him. "Have I made myself clear?" he asked again as he reached his car. When she did not reply, he made as though to approach the house once more. "I'll be seeing you in August, or it could be late July, and that's the last time I'll see you, Eilis." "How do you know my name?" she asked. "That husband of yours is a great talker. That's how I know your name. He told my wife all about you." Now.
Is that what we do? Well, thank you, Colm, for that wonderful rendition. I asked Colm backstage if he would also do an Italian-American accent. He declined.
Don't try.
For unknown reasons. So the first thing that I want to ask you is just, it's a little daring to write a sequel these days because they come out of the woodwork, right, from everything. And so I'm curious, what made you feel convinced and confident that you had a story for a sequel, especially for a story like Brooklyn that sort of went around the world and back again?
I'm against sequels. They're cheap, and writers shouldn't do them. And if we'd had them in the past, the 19th century would be a disaster. Just think about the books that you love from the 19th century. Think about Pride and Prejudice, where we would learn slowly that Mr. Darcy was a gambler, or that he was mean, or that he was just boring and she was bored with him. And obviously the big one is Ulysses, where, it happens over one day. So it ends with Molly Bloom saying yes. But imagine if she woke up an hour later and the day started again with a sequel to Ulysses, based on the Iliad, and Moby Dick had a brother, and, it just goes on, really. And so I've written 11 novels, so I've had to write 11 sequels. Really, time is short. And So, I mean, what happened was that I never thought of doing it. And what strange it is, no publisher ever said to me, you know what, we'd love you to do, instead of writing one of those books about one of those German writers or something, could you just give us a break and write a sequel? But I wouldn't have then. You know, I would have thought, no, that's a commercial decision. If you ever start doing that as a writer, you lose something really important. Even if it isn't in the book, there's some connection between you and the reader that's now been fouled, or that's been gnarled, or that's been destroyed, or damaged at least. What happened was that I got this idea, which I've just read to you. It came into my head from just really from nowhere, but I was also starting to think about plot and thinking about openings of novels are so hard to deal with because you don't know who, where, when, and often it's a distraction, the opening few pages, where they tell you something about some landscape you're never going to know again, or some strange distracted thing, and you think, get on with the story, just tell us what's happening. And I mean, at least James Joyce begins Ulysses with stately, plump Buck Mulligan. But then again, Buck Mulligan doesn't reappear greatly in the book after that. Like, writers should stop this business of distracting you with their openings. And at least...
My editors tell me that all the time.
And so I got this idea. Just this simple thing, that two Irish people meeting in Long Island, he's Irish and she's Irish, and they're meeting over this small matter. And she could, you see, he has to be Irish because she has to be able to read him. If he's American, it could just look like an idle threat. She wouldn't be sure. With this man, she's absolutely certain that everything he says is true. He's the sort of man she knows from home. And therefore, I just got that idea. And once I got the idea, then I could write the book. So the book, in a way, is a sequel to that 3 pages, rather than, say, taking up what... I mean, the problem, in a way, with a sequel to the novel Brooklyn is that these 25 years have been reasonably happy. And reasonable happiness is not good for drama. You can't get much out. I mean, I could try and get, you know, she had a baby and then, you know, the baby was 1, the first birthday party, maybe baby goes to school, you know, like, you know, winter becomes spring. But I couldn't, there was nothing I could find, because what I need more than anything is for her to go home, and meaning home to Ireland. And I need something to cause her to want to go home. And then I can work, in a way, with that movement between there and home. If she's just there, there's nothing I can really do with that. So to that extent, I felt that the fatal... Henry James used the phrase fatal cheapness, that if the fatal cheapness might be just lessened a bit, because I thought I had another book.
Did you know right away that that woman at the door was Eilish? Or was she... just an Irish figure?
No, she was always Eilish.
Okay. Now, I'm interested in this because, you know, you were just talking about sort of, it's hard to write about happiness. It's very uninteresting. But you write a lot about goodness in Brooklyn, or I should say a lot of the characters in Brooklyn are inherently good people, decent people. And Tony is beyond decent. I mean, he's sort of like an unimaginably good guy. And in the first page of this book, we discover that he is not the good guy anymore, or at least he is seriously screwed up. And I'm curious about making that decision to take this fundamentally decent person and really drop a bomb.
I suppose that God made adultery so that we could have novels, you know, that in other words, the only point in having somebody who's good is to see what you could do with that. And, you know, so that if you give someone a very large characteristic like good, watch it, because if you just keep that going, it will really become tedious. So, I think in Brooklyn, he needed to be like that so that Eilish could do various things, which would be, say, ethically dubious or strange, or make her someone who's sort of both willful and passive. But he needed to be good. I didn't want him to do anything other than just love her and want her and be true to her. And therefore she could then, you get a lot of space then to make her. This time around, all I wanted was the idea that for once in his 40s, this guy just did this one thing. But that this doesn't define him. Or at least I hope it doesn't. I was trying in that whole first section to make it that I was going to say he didn't mean it. But you know what I mean. And God, we're going through a bad time.
Oh, no,
I take that back. We're going through a bad time with all the business of adultery. But You know what I'm talking about. But but what I wanted was to just break up the family a bit to see what she would then do. And of course, what I must do then is he must have a very good relationship with his daughter, Tony, and with his son. He must seem to, everything works in every other way. So in a way, there's a moment when she's going to the airport with him. He's driving her to the airport where she's going home. And she wants to say to him, if you do something, I will leave you. And she can't bring herself to say it. And you realize that whatever bond there is between them hasn't been broken. It's been badly damaged. So her going back to Ireland means that she's made no big decision. It's tentative, which leaves me a lot of space to work with now. It's not as though she's made up her mind about anything.
So you send, Eilis sends herself back to Ireland, back to Enniscorthy. And I'm curious what happens to your writing when you're back in Ireland, when you're writing back in Ireland versus, in some of your novels, in The Master, right, Henry James is all over the map. He's in Florence, he's in Venice, he's in Ireland. But I'm curious, when you're writing and you're writing about Ireland, you call it home for her, which is interesting because she's an American now. Is it still home? But I'm curious, what happens for you when you are writing a scene that is back in your home? Does it change things?
I wrote a novel called The Blackwater Lightship, and it happens in Ireland over 6 days with 6 people, and filled with, outdoors is filled with rain, indoors is filled with making tea and recrimination. And there's a lot of unforgiveness and grievance and death. And when it was over, I thought, I never, ever want to do that again. I never want to see Irish rain, Irish mist, Irish misery. I just want none of it. And then the idea of Henry James came to me, which meant I could go to Venice for research. I could write about duchesses and glamour, so that, you suddenly had a whole world that was so free of all that. But of course, the minute it was over, I wanted to go back, or I felt easy about going back. I think I wrote Brooklyn after that, I think, yeah. And so I think something happens to the prose that you can use a much more muted style. You can bring the colors down. You can use much plainer sentences, and you can get some sort of expression or some sort of internal energy by just doing that, by just sticking to that. And it's almost as though there's something in the landscape or in the light, and also in the way people behave, because of course people don't even think things that they don't want anyone else to know. So there's a constant sense of, who knows what. And in this book, even more so, I think, where the number of secrets being held. So you're talking all the time about forms of reticence and forms of tact becoming forms of secrecy. And so you're moving all the time between, say, reticence, tact, and secrecy to see what you can do with that.
I had about 1,000 questions about reticence because it's sort of the big word that comes out a lot in your writing. And I'm curious about how hard that is to write, because you have all of it. You have all of the information. How hard is it to decide who says what and how much they hold back? And and I'm also curious if this is, for you, a particularly Irish trait, because Tony, the one American, is like, he's got no secrets other than this big one. He says everything that comes into his mind. And so, how do you do that? How do you decide what comes out and how to give us information without almost giving it to your characters?
People see it as an Irish trait, but I don't really. I think any small group of people, including a family, there are things you won't tell people. For example, I think all of us know that when you go home in your early 20s, at some point, there's something you don't tell your parents. I think every one of us has had it, even if it's nothing. Even if you must be taking a lot of drugs up there and you realize you're not. You can't confess to them, I'm actually not taking any drugs. In other words, that would be an extreme version, but I mean that all of us have that sort of sense of the number of things you can't tell. So I don't see it, but it is in this book, Eilis comes home from America. She's had that experience with Tony. She doesn't want her mother to know. It might sound easy that she doesn't want to worry her mother, but also her mother will start worrying her. It will become the big subject of every day, that awful husband of yours in America, and therefore she just doesn't want her to know. So that becomes the first secret. And then you move in from secret to secret to secret. And even though it's a small town and people think it could be filled with gossip, people don't find out much about other people in this book. I mean, the secrets are kept a lot of the time.
I'm curious, speaking of Eilish's mother, you wrote an essay, this was a long time ago, and I'm sorry, because you're probably like, oh God, I've written a million essays. But you wrote an essay a very long time ago in the London Review of Books, and it's about ants in novels, the importance of ants. And you wrote about how you need to take away mothers to give people agency, right? You can't have a mother there lording over a child and then want that child to go on an adventure of any kind. And in this novel, there is a mother, and she is very present. And I'm curious what happened when you put this mother in there and you knew that she was going to be sort of watching and judging, because she's a hoot.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, Isabel Archer, Portrait of a Lady, has no mother. Dorothea in Middlemarch. You can just go right on through the 19th century, and there are a lot of heroines, and it is that their growth is possible in the absence of a mother, but in the presence of an aunt or an aunt figure. Something like Persuasion, say, that Anne Elliot has no mother, but she has a sort of surrogate aunt. So, her mother has not been with her all the years in America. So when she comes home, it is as though she's come home to a stranger. And they have to sort of rebuild or recreate a relationship, which begins as, I think, very difficult when she comes home. But that it isn't as though her mother has been there all the time watching over her or guiding her. So it's not been like that. So it is as though she comes home to a stranger.
As much as I love a strong female character, the idea of a strong female character has basically become like a selling point in commercial fiction, right? Like every novel is like a strong woman, as if all women are strong in the same exact way, and that's being loud and brash or whatever it is. And what was interesting about Eilish is that what we discover at the beginning of Long Island is that she hasn't been happy, but she hasn't been unhappy, and she's sort of floated in this strange space in between. You have said a few times in public that you really liked the ending of the movie, where they gave her a happy ending at the end of Brooklyn that wasn't written in your novel.
I couldn't do it, no.
And you gave us a very ambiguous ending. And so the ending that we kind of get for her here is that she's been stuck in this suburban cul-de-sac, living next door to her mother-in-law, who she likes, but still living next door to her mother-in-law. No offense to everyone out there with in-laws. And she's a little bit stuck. She doesn't have friends. She doesn't have a social life. And I'm curious, you sort of are admitting that she, in many ways, is not strong enough to go after the things that she wants. So tell me about deciding on her character and, how much she's willing to exert to get what she wants. Or,
I mean, I don't really know this strong woman thing. It doesn't mean anything to me. That she is the second sister with an older, powerful sister. And anyone who's ever watched this realizes that the second sister manages to live in shadow very successfully while the older sister does all the negotiation. In this case, when she goes to America first, it isn't as though she's not self-conscious. She doesn't dress up. She doesn't make an effort. But yet people want her and like her and trust her. Now that she's in Long Island, it isn't as though she has asserted herself. She's a job, but it's not much of a job. And what's happened to her, which was a big thing that happened in my house or in our house at home, was in Ireland, if you moved in 1960 something, say 67, 68, from reading the Irish Press newspaper to reading the Irish Times newspaper. That was a very big move because the Irish Times was a liberal Protestant newspaper that was modernizing itself to become a liberal newspaper for all Ireland. It was getting a lot of young women to write for it, and it was raising a lot of really thorny, difficult subjects in a very literate way. My mother moved 1 month from one paper to the other. It was a huge thing because it was an expression of defiance of some sort against, an old-fashioned view of how life in Ireland might be conducted. And so what happens in this book is a tiny little moment where Eilis manages to get the New York Times every Sunday. And while the others are all this is 1976, and while the others are all at lunch, big long family lunch, she's on her own, just across from them, going through the New York Times carefully, getting views on, she has already had views on Nixon, on Vietnam, but she's sort of slowly beginning to educate herself in some way, partly through her daughter, who's now, what, 17, 18, who's immensely intelligent and ambitious, and is probably going to go to Fordham. And her brother-in-law, who's sort of gay uncle, who's living in Manhattan, who's filled with ideas. So that there is a beginning for her of change, but it's slow, and it doesn't use the word feminism. It doesn't talk like that, because that's not how it's working. And so she is slowly emerging. But what she's done actually is that she's worked very closely with her children, so that she has it. The effort is, for my part, to make that seem like it's a relationship of equals. They listen and they talk all the time. The four of them, Tony. So that idea that she has had that it isn't as though she's been a sort of distant mother or a lonely figure. Actually, within the house, she's not that. But it's not as though she's, as you say, a strong woman, or she's not out to win America and become a great, that the American dream or the American whatever has got to her. It's not like that.
This is set in 1976, and Brooklyn is set, it's sometime in the early 1950s. And I'm curious about the difference writing a female main character in those two eras, particularly in Ireland. Because I don't think most, maybe it's just me, but doesn't have a good idea of how much things changed for women in Ireland in those years, and if it followed the American trajectory at all. Because what's interesting is in Brooklyn, it's post-war Europe, and so we imagine some sort of optimism, and still in the town, people don't have jobs. You need to leave to make a success of yourself. And I'm curious what the intervening 25 years mean for those characters, and especially for the women.
Well, in the book, I have Nancy, who's in her mid-40s as well, and she is clearly having an affair with, he's not married, but nonetheless, she's having sex with a man. And if it was 1951, she wouldn't be doing that, and she wouldn't be doing that for religious reasons, but that now in 76, she can do that. She's still talking about going to confession, and she clearly goes to mass, and she knows the priest. So it's not as though, in other words, people moved away from Catholicism very slowly, gradually, and in ways that suited themselves. And in the same way as people just could eat meat on Friday, people decided they could have sex with someone if they wanted to, even if they weren't married to him or her. So Nancy is, you can see Nancy beginning that. It's also, Nancy will go to Dublin to buy clothes. Nancy's daughters want to make the living room, to take down the wallpaper, put up paint. There's a whole way of decorating the house, for example. So the fact that Jim's pub is being inhabited by old-timers and by young teachers or young lawyers in the town, that could not have happened in the early 50s. It became a feature of towns like that in the 70s, that a bar like that would become sort of mixed. I don't mean mixed in gay, straight, or mixed in male, female, as much as mixed in class. And so there are a whole lot of very small things. And the fact that also her mother still doesn't have a telephone and doesn't talk of getting a telephone, which would be quite common not to have a telephone in that town in 1976. I think we certainly had no telephone. And the getting in of the fridge, and because the fridge and the, would be electricity. I mean, people say, how am I going to pay for it? But it's not, I bought it for you. No, I have to pay the electricity bill. And that electricity bill could be seen by people without much money as a terrible thing that you wouldn't know what it would be next month. And I lived in a house where we were permanently turning off lights. The biggest sin you could commit, almost, that's not precisely true, was to leave on a light in the hall, or, what's that light? Who left on the light? So it's just like, we might go upstairs in a while. Yeah, but turn it on then. And so you'd be constantly watching, especially for some funny reason, electricity. So her mother says to her eventually, when she wants to buy her mother a fridge and a new oven and a washing machine, says, oh, I'll be paying the electricity bill while you're sunning yourself in America. And it was that whole idea of that in America, that's what you do, you sun yourself.
So you write frequently about people at moments of great risk, when they're about to take a big risk, or they're deciding if they should take a big risk. I'm thinking of Nora Webster getting a job after being a woman who stayed at home. In Henry James, he decides to write a play. It goes very, very badly. And in this case, Eilish is deciding what she should do with her future. I mean, should she stay with this man? Should she be in America? All these things. I'm curious, what appeals to you about that moment for people? Writing that moment when people are deciding about taking a huge risk.
I think this book is different in the sense that there really are moments where she could do something that would change her life. I mean, completely. And my interest in this is that it's drama, that here we have it. Somebody, the reader will turn the page, and it's that interest in just getting to see if the seamless turning of the page could occur, where you don't know what she's going to do. She doesn't, because she doesn't know what she's going to do. And that for me is you can get an energy from that. If she'd made up her mind, I'm not sure I could work with that. But when she hasn't made up her mind, and you realize she doesn't know enough, as much as you know as the reader, so I'm just become interested in then, I suppose, in manipulating that and dramatizing that to see what energy I can get from that, which might cause the reader to become more deeply engaged in the book.
There's a line in The Master where you write that Henry James feels powerful for the first time in his life when he writes. And I'm curious if you feel powerful when you write or powerless.
I never feel, powerful. Medvedev is powerful sometimes when he gets a shot, but no, I don't think like, sometimes you're working, you just think, if I could just get this down right. And often it is that you're having an argument with yourself, that you notice, she feels this. No, that's not good enough. She needs to feel, just say she's home. And she feels what? No, don't use the word feel. What does she do? She talks, constantly you're erasing and you're adding and you're trying to find a way through to say that she felt ambiguous, that she had a number of feelings all at the same time, none of which can easily be named. So you're constantly, as it were, trying to, I suppose, make the narrative more complex, or just see if there's anything more that she could feel that's the opposite of what she's just felt a second ago. You want that sort of wavering, flickering set of feelings. And to do that, you just have to keep adding and adding and adding and cutting and cutting and cutting. But there's no power in it. In a way, you're constantly, actually, there's a powerlessness in it because you're constantly realizing this is maybe not good enough. This is maybe not good enough. I need one more thing. I need one more, and just cut that. So it's far too tentative in a way, a process to be able to describe in relation to power.
I'm curious. Sort of adept readers will see that there is a little bit of a universe that you're building here, in the sense that characters from Nora Webster show up here. Obviously, it's related to Brooklyn. I'm curious about that little world and how you decided that these novels would have that connection, and instead of sort of, you could stay in the same location and still build entirely different worlds, but you've sort of let them wander, like, Clarissa Dalloway on the Voyage. You've sort of let them wander into one another's paths.
Yeah, I think there are 5 novels, and it starts with the Heather Blazing, the Blackwater Lightship, Brooklyn, Nora Webster, and this, and they're all set in that location with the beach, which is 10 miles away, or the Strand, as it's called locally. And the town of Enniscorthy, with the town of Wexford being mentioned with trips to Dublin. So that's the hinterland, that's the topography. And then in that, the first novel begins with the judge and his wife. And they get a vague mention in this new novel where she's giving directions. And, past the judge's house. That's just a sly reference to the judge. In the next one, the Blackwater Lightship, Lily Devereux is the daughter. Well, she's at the wedding in this new novel. So she's an old friend of Nancy. And then Mrs. Devereux, the mother, gives Jim directions. So that's the Heather Blazing Blackwater Lightship. There's Brooklyn, as you know. And then Nora Webster. Well, Nora Webster is important. Nora Webster's sister, Catherine, appears in this book as well as Nora Webster to tell her where to buy her clothes in Dublin. So yes, it's a sort of sly joke. It's a set of just sly references that amuse me, that sort of anchors the whole thing as though I'm slowly building an Enniscorthy all of my own. And I mean, it only satisfied. But there was a funny moment when I was in China just before the pandemic, and so I'd only done it 4 times then. And a young girl, like she was doing a doctorate, stood up and pointed at me accusingly and said, "You have used a character from one of your books in another." And as though this was something that maybe in Chinese law, or in the general sense of world decorum, like was really something that if it continued would cause havoc, as you can imagine. And I had to admit that I had done this. But then, of course, she laughed, and it wasn't a full accusation. She just thought it was a really funny idea that you would not just do it, but admit to it, and admit to it cheerfully,
There was some crime in reusing your own work.
She had discovered it and just wanted to know, like, what if this was new, or like, why? If Anna Karenina, like, just imagine, it would cause havoc in the 19th. I keep going off the 19th century, but imagine if Graham Greene did it.
I'm curious about one more thing. You have relied a lot on the diaries, letters, anecdotes of former great writers. Obviously, Henry James, Thomas Mann. I'm curious if this makes you more or less likely to leave behind things of your own. Do you keep a diary? Is it hidden? Will it burn?
No diary. I don't know. A diary is hard because you think, well, who's this? If you're not writing for an audience, if you're not writing for readers, who are you writing for? And it's a vitally important matter, I think, at the moment, where there's a lot of temptation to become a sort of. I think for me it would be narcissism to start writing about myself, and to think that the page, as far as I'm concerned, is blank. It is not a mirror, and you look at it and you got to fill it. But there's no point in thinking I could start writing about myself in it. So a diary would be no help to me or use to me. And also with notebooks, I don't even do notebooks, because if you can't remember something, it's clearly no use to you. And if you start to write it down, you'll forget where you wrote it down. You'll find it years later saying, but why did I write that down? But letters are different, because when I was in Spain, I lived in Spain between the ages of 20 and 23. So I had 3 years in Spain. And I wrote home every week. And the letter was for everyone to read. It would be passed around. My old auntie Kathleen would get to read it, and everyone would read it. And so they must have been very clean, the letters. In other words, nothing that I wouldn't want everyone to read. They're still, I think, totally embarrassing. And I found them in a bag, all of them, and I have them. But I couldn't face, could anyone face reading your letters home when you were 20? And you just go, oh, sorry, there's some people who are just 20, but don't write home. So that's the only thing I have. I don't know what to do with it. I don't know. God. Ugh.
Someone's going to get those now. I'm sorry to tell you.
I have them in a room in Dublin. If the house leaks, it'll be the end of them, I think.
So I think that's going to wrap up the part of this that is our conversation. So thank you so much, Colm. We're going to open things up. We're going to open things up to a Q&A. If you have a question, if you could come and use the microphone that's right here. If you can't get up or can't reach a microphone, we can also bring you on or help you.
I have a question about how you handle different periods. Not centuries away that people know are going to be different, but someone may not know how things were like 40 years ago for somebody who lived through that. Something like the milk used to come with the cream on top and a silver piece and things like that. How do you introduce that gracefully so that the people who knew nothing about that become familiar with that in your story?
In this book, 1976 is the last year that I was in Enniscorthy for the whole summer. So I would have visited afterwards, but I would not have been there all the time. So that therefore, every object or every, for example, what sort of pub people went to, or what the town was like at night, or all of those things I know. So I'm working from experience. And it's very important sometimes not to put in too much period detail. And that, of course, thing with the bottle of milk and the cream and is the sort of thing that you can put in once, but don't try another trick with it of naming sandwich spread, chicken and ham paste, the L and N. Don't fill the book with these things. William Trevor is pretty good on this, where he'll find one thing that will situate you in a year, but he won't do it. He won't then need to do it again.
But if they didn't know what a party line was, for example, party
yeah,
it could be a critical part.
Yeah, and the only thing you can do with that is just leave it to the reader to either not know it or find out. But you can't. Obviously, you can't footnote, but I mean, you can't just put, "Oh, that was the way milk was at that time." Although there are. I mean, in Middlemarch, for example, George Eliot has the arrival of the railways, and someone more or less says that they don't think that sort of thing is going to happen. Much. So it's a lovely ironic moment. And the nearest I got to it is I have it in a story where a woman. There's a thing in Ireland opens called Dunn Stores, and it's very important for this novel because it takes over all the grocery systems in Ireland, and all the grocery is Dunn Stores, and they become also where you buy clothes. Everything is Dunn Stores, and a woman early on says, "Oh, at that Dunn Stores, I don't think that'll catch on at all." And I have another one where a woman, it's in Brooklyn, where she doesn't want to buy a television because there's no one can guarantee her that they'll continue making programs. And you just think, like, these tiny moments at the beginning of something. But if you did that for the whole book, people would just say you're just a clown, And so I try not to. Thank you.
So you had mentioned that in the book, Eilis doesn't know what she's going to do. But do you know what she's going to do, or did you sort of discover it as you were writing?
I always know before I start what I'm doing. And the thing is to fill in the details and to make sure. Sometimes you'll get something new, but not much, but not the overall motive or the overall result or how things are going to pan out in the end.
So the character doesn't change your mind?
No, really, the process. I know other people find that the process gives them all the energy, but I get all that before.
They put a post here so you wouldn't see how many people still waiting in the queue. So I was curious, in your reading, which was great, thank you. So when you read it, do you think to yourself, "Oh, pretty good"? Just kind of, or do you think to yourself, "Oh God, I'm sick of it. What am I blabbering about? I am going to read something else next time"?
I think what happens with a novel is that you find 2 or 3 bits you can read, and you tend to stick to them, and then you forget other bits. You just you never read the book. You never read the book again.
Yeah.
So you find 2 or 3 bits that might work. In other words, you don't have to introduce them too much, and that might have some sort of interior drama. But you wouldn't want to. I've never done one of my novels as an audio, and I don't think I should be encouraged, because there's nothing worse than a novelist trying to act.
I don't know. E.B. White did pretty well.
Don't encourage it.
Actually, for people who are interested in hearing a little bit more of the novel read, there's a video on YouTube of the actress Jessie Buckley.
Jessie Buckley reads it, yeah.
Reading, I think it's just the first, maybe it's a 5-minute read.
And
but
she does the American
beautifully.
accents.
Yeah, she does the American accents. And she does it beautifully. So.
Hi. Do you think of your characters after you're done writing a book? Or is it that, do they stay with you? Or is it that's it, out of sight, out of mind? And if you do think about them, have you thought of Eilis in the past 15 years before you decided to write this? And is this the life you thought she'd have, or this is where she would end up?
Yeah, you become very close to the characters because you keep giving them detail. I mean, a novel is 1,000 details. So you keep adding detail after detail, and often the details are things that because the mind is lazy, you use the thing nearest to you that you can find. So therefore you keep building and building from mixtures of imagination, experience, and memory. And so, yes, that the characters become very close. And when John Crowley was directing the film of Brooklyn, he asked me in a very serious way, was there one moment in the book that I thought needed real care in the film? I mean, not just in the script, but for him as the director. And I hadn't thought of that, but I did immediately know what to say, which was, Tony brings her out to he brings her out to Long Island in Brooklyn, and he shows her the Greenfield site. He said, this is where we're going to build. In other words, this is the life you can have with me here. We will build a house together. But my mother and father, because they want to move out, my brothers, we'll all move out, and we want you to come with us. And that's the choice she's offered. It's not just to be with him, but to be with him in something that he has already envisaged. And so I did, in my mind, know that that is what would happen, and then that she would raise her family there. But I didn't then see. You see, that's no use. As I said before, raising her family is no use to me. I need one thing to happen. And of course, I could. How do you think of that? I mean, what? You think, surely the adultery plot's over. Surely we're done with that. Is there one more way that can be done? And so the baby. Yeah.
Thank you for this. When you write, do you consider how you can advance the novel as a form of art, or is that beyond what you're trying to do?
Oh, that's a tremendous question. I can answer that immediately. I teach Ulysses now every year at Columbia. We take the book. It's a seminar of about 15 students and me. I'm a student too, and we take the book and we try and read it over the whole semester. So that's 14 weeks for 18 episodes, and I realize I'm dealing with some sort of that the levels of innovation, the levels of confidence and wit, the levels of ambition in that book. Is just levels, that's a plural, are just so high and so grand and so impressive that the idea that even you're working in its shadow is a bad idea. That I'm writing sort of chamber music. I'm writing probably at the very end of a tradition for writing for 3 instruments. And it's sort of slightly wistful, and there's nothing more I can do. And I know I don't feel that I'm adding to the form. And I wish I was, but I can't. And there's nothing worse than trying out a big experiment that your heart is not in. Yes, so it's more or less, it's a song for a singer with no accompaniment, much, maybe a bit of piano, or it's a trio. And sometimes it might even be a string quartet, but that would be too ambitious. But it's certainly not a symphony. I mean what I do.
Hi, I really appreciated your answer about why you wrote the sequel, as well as how you could do this to a really decent person. I'm curious. It feels like that was my initial reaction is, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is happening to Tony. And it seems like it's a huge risk. And I've only just started the book, but from what the critics are saying and what I'm gathering, you really pulled it off. So I'm just curious if you felt like it was a big risk and if you were afraid at all when you put this book out there about what the reaction might be.
I had to really work on what happens afterwards, that to set up, really important, that Tony's relationship with his daughter from the time she was a baby has been sort of special, that they're always talking to each other. Tony's relationship with his son is non-competitive, and that the atmosphere in the house is completely easy, so that there's nothing about Tony to suggest that he's in any way, I suppose, that he is a problem within the family, that the domestic harmony is great. So I was hoping the reader, but I think I'm wrong. I don't think I pulled this off, by the way, because I was hoping the reader would just say, this is something could easily happen. It's over. He's utterly mortified, as you can imagine, at the whole business of what's happened. And could we now start, in other words, we cannot judge him simply on the basis of this. But I'm not sure you can do that to a character in fiction so easily as you might do it to someone in life, say, or you might do it to someone, if you're a priest in the confessional, you'd have to say, well, go, my child, and sin no more. Who's to throw the first stone? But I think those sort of religious things about forgiveness don't operate when you're reading a novel. So I think I got slightly caught in putting that big bang in at the beginning and then leaving the readers to judge him, because what else can you do? You've been given just a small amount of information. So I did try in the subsequent pages to soften it, but it's still hard for the reader to feel that softening. And so it's a problem. You're absolutely right. It's a problem.
Thank you.
Can I ask you a question about that? Don't you think that's almost more valuable, that you're making it difficult for the reader? That we have to imagine that moment where we know that someone is a good person, and they've done this egregious thing. You're putting the reader in a moral pickle, which is actually a great place to put a reader.
Yeah, but you have to remember that there's a very big difference about how that matter would be viewed in America and in Italy. That, in other words, there are some countries and languages in which this would not be, there would not be so much a judgment about a man doing that. I think that's changing. I think in Italy too it's changing. That's no longer the acceptance of that. But I think it's a cultural thing, and I'm noticing that with the younger generation in America, it's particularly harsh. In other words, people have no time for ideas of easy laughter about infidelity. I don't think that's I don't think things are softening here in that way. I think that there is a sort of high moral judgment on this matter, and it's not a judgment that I'm easy about, that I have a fixed view on. So I'm probably not at one with a lot of readers on this. It's not as though, but I just wanted the reader to get this, to get this and think, how now am I to view all this? How am I to view this family? How am I to view this man? How am I to view her when she goes home? What should she do? So I suppose, they're giving I suppose because I can't write murder, I don't want to write I don't write about murder, that therefore you need something which will ask the reader to judge and then to wonder if they've misjudged. But it's a delicate process because culturally there are great differences between countries even in how these matters are judged.
I wanted to ask about Henry James and the Master. And I really felt that book was a tour de force, but I'm curious, with James's labyrinthine sentences, which I adore, did you find yourself having to, how did you negotiate dealing with his style? Did it become your style, or did you try not to let that happen? Was it a problem or a challenge?
This is about Henry James's style. I think his style is one of the great creations, and you really want to be very brave to think that you could ape it or parody it or do anything with it. But what I tried to do in the novel I wrote was to write as though Hemingway had never existed. In other words, those little sentences that where you bury emotion in between words. He walked on later on. He walked on. That you just can't do that anymore. So no little sentences, but then try and make the longer ones seem part of your breath. Work with breath rather than attempting to write a very long sentence and then put in some subclauses later on, add some semicolons, a dash, and a little word in French. In other words, that's a parody of James's style. But in other words, if it wasn't natural to my voice,
that's what I'm getting.
Not to my speaking voice as much as to some interior voice, that it was no use to me, and I would know immediately. But the thing was just try and bring it up a bit, just longer sentences, more ruminative, more modifying, more qualifying, but there's no single style in James. It does change. Even in a paragraph, it can change. So, but I was aware of it, and I was aware, please don't try this trick. Yeah. So that therefore the idea of no trick, but make it as natural as possible. That was the idea anyway.
Yeah, so it was a challenge. Yeah.
It certainly was a challenge, yeah.
Thank you. I'm just curious, do you write in a linear fashion? In other words, do you begin at the beginning and work all the way to the end? Or do you cheat a bit and go forward and work your way back?
No, you can't, you see, because with a novel like this one, you really can't do that because it really depends all the time on levels of accretion over who knows what. If that's there, I have to put that after that. And if I've gone ahead, then really I will have to cut what I've done ahead. So no, it would have to move chronologically in that clunky, old-fashioned way of telling the story and then. But this time, after the first section, every other section is told in three. That it's told from Eilis's point of view, then from Jim's point of view, and then from Nancy's point of view as another woman in the novel. And it's not first person, it's not voice, it's their perspective. And the question then is technical. You have to, within 3 sentences each time, you have to know it's from their perspective. So you have to put their name in, but not just their name, something where they're watching something or seeing something. So you're in their world almost immediately. And 3 or 4 times in the book, the same scene is seen from 2 perspectives. And the only way the person who encouraged me most to do this was Joseph Conrad in Victory. I don't know if anyone's read this book, but it's a late Conrad novel in which everything is told from two perspectives. So like he's on the island, he sees them coming to get him. They're coming to get him, and we see them coming, and it's marvelous if you can do it. But again, it was something I tried to do more, and I had to cut back because it can be really boring. I mean, the idea, I know what the wedding was like. I don't need you to tell me one more time, just from someone else's perspective, what the cake tasted like. So you've got to be really careful with it. It's really dangerous.
Thank you.
Okay, I think that's all we've got time for. So that was.
I thought you were going to ask a question.
Come out of nowhere. Yeah, so thank you so much. Can we have a round of applause for Colm and Hilary?